White billionaire construction CEO shocked to see a worker identical to his lost black daughter. "Sir, you need to come down from the ledge." The construction foreman's panicked voice echoed across the Manhattan job site as billionaire James Wellington stood 35 floors above the street, gripping the steel beam with white knuckles. "Think about your family." But James laughed bitterly through his tears. "What family? My daughter is dead." Just as a fearless young black woman in a hard hat rappelled down from above, her safety line swinging in the wind. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice cutting through his despair. "I don't know what you've lost, but ending it won't bring them back." When their eyes met across the void, time stopped, because James was staring at the impossible, his dead daughter's face on a stranger's body. Before we get deep into today's story, I really want to know where you are watching from across the world. Please, drop in the comments section where you're watching. Hit the subscribe button if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have created something very special just for you. Another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Once again, welcome to Mr. Paul's Stories, where we come together like old friends, wrapped in the warmth of stories that light up our souls. Now, let's begin today's story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the skeletal frame of what would soon become Wellington Tower, the newest addition to Manhattan's ever-reaching skyline. From his climate-controlled office on the 40th floor of the adjacent Wellington Plaza, James Wellington stood with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying his empire. At 52, he commanded respect with silver-streaked temples and eyes that missed nothing. A man who had built his construction dynasty from a single bulldozer inherited from his father to a billion-dollar enterprise spanning from New York to Los Angeles. But those same keen eyes that could spot a structural flaw from a mile away couldn't see past the hollow ache that had taken residence in his chest 3 years ago. The pristine office around him, awards lining mahogany shelves, photos with mayors and governors, architectural models of his greatest achievements, felt like a mausoleum. Beautiful. Cold. Empty. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Wellington, the site foreman needs to discuss the beam installation timeline." James pressed the button with more force than necessary. "Tell Rodriguez I'll be down in 20 minutes. And Margaret, cancel my lunch with the mayor. I need to be on site today." Margaret's surprise was audible through the speaker. In 3 years, James had rarely set foot on an active construction site, preferring to manage his empire from the sterile safety of boardrooms and conference calls. "Sir, are you certain? Your schedule." "Cancel it all." 23 stories below and 2,000 miles away in spirit, Zara Johnson secured her hard hat and checked her tool belt one final time. At 25, she possessed the kind of focused determination that came from knowing every paycheck mattered, every day counted. Her calloused hands, hands that could operate a crane with surgical precision or comfort a frightened child with equal skill, gripped the safety harness as she prepared for another day of high-steel work on Manhattan's newest monument to wealth. The other workers called her Z, a name that fit her quick movements and quicker wit. She was one of only 3 women on the crew, and the only black woman, facts she carried not as burdens but as badges of honor. Every morning, she proved herself again. Every evening, she sent half her paycheck home to her aging grandmother in Detroit, the woman who had raised her after her parents died in a car crash when she was 7. "Z, you're on the 35th floor today," shouted Mike Rodriguez, the site foreman. We're behind on the beam connections." She nodded, already mentally calculating the work ahead. The 35th floor meant she'd be visible from the executive floors of Wellington Plaza. Not that it mattered. Men like James Wellington lived in a different universe, one where people like her were just moving parts in their grand designs. As she stepped into the construction elevator, surrounded by the familiar scent of steel dust and coffee breath, Zara had no way of knowing that today would shatter both their worlds. She thought about her grandmother's words from their phone call last night. "Baby girl, sometimes the Lord puts us exactly where we need to be, even when we can't see His plan." The elevator lurched upward, carrying her toward a destiny neither she nor James could have imagined. What do you think happens when two worlds collide? Have you ever had a moment that changed everything in an instant? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment. The construction elevator's mechanical were filled the silence as James descended from his penthouse office, each floor marking his reluctant return to the world he'd once loved. The hard hat felt foreign on his head. When had he become the kind of CEO who lived in boardrooms instead of blueprints? When had he stopped being the man who knew every rivet, every beam, every worker's name? He knew exactly when. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. The elevator shuddered to a stop at the 35th floor, and James stepped onto the raw concrete, breathing in the familiar cocktail of steel dust, welding smoke, and honest sweat. For a moment, just a moment, the ache in his chest loosened. This was real. This was building something that would outlast him, something that mattered. "Mr. Wellington." Rodriguez jogged over, his face flushed with surprise and barely concealed panic. "Sir, I wasn't expecting the safety protocols." "Relax, Rodriguez. I built buildings before I built spreadsheets." James's voice carried the authority of a man who'd once operated cranes in Chicago winters and poured concrete under the Texas sun. "Show me where we stand." They walked through the maze of steel beams and temporary platforms, Rodriguez rattling off progress reports and timeline concerns. But James's attention drifted, pulled by something he couldn't name, a restlessness that had nothing to do with construction schedules and everything to do with the hollow space where his heart used to be. 30 feet away, Zara emerged from the freight elevator, her tool belt jangling softly as she surveyed the beam connections she'd been assigned. The morning sun, filtered through the building's skeleton, cast geometric shadows across the concrete floor. She moved with practiced efficiency, checking her safety lines, testing her equipment, preparing for another day of dancing with gravity and steel. She reached up to adjust her hard hat, the motion pulling her hair free from its careful tuck. For just a moment, the wind caught the loose strands, and she paused to push them back, her profile outlined against the Manhattan skyline. That's when James saw her. The world didn't stop slowly. It shattered like glass, every piece of his carefully constructed composure scattering in an instant. His breath caught in his throat, and his hand reached out instinctively, grasping for something solid as his knees threatened to buckle. The same delicate jawline. The same way of tilting her head when concentrating. The same graceful movement of hands that had once been small enough to fit in his palm, but had grown capable of creating art, of lighting up rooms, of making him believe in miracles. "Amelia," he whispered, the name torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Rodriguez was still talking about beam schedules, his words becoming white noise as James stared across the construction site. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He had held his daughter's lifeless hand in that hospital room. He had spoken at her funeral. He had watched them lower her casket into the ground at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, the same cemetery where she'd loved to read beneath the old oak trees. But there she was, moving with the same unconscious grace, the same way of pursing her lips when she was thinking the same. "Sir? Mr. Wellington." Rodriguez's voice seemed to come from underwater. "Are you all right?" Zara turned slightly, and James caught sight of her profile again. His vision blurred, and he realized his cheeks were wet. When had he started crying? When had his chest begun to feel like it might cave in? She bent to pick up a wrench, and the motion was so achingly familiar that James took an involuntary step forward. How many times had he watched Amelia bend that same way to retrieve her colored pencils from the art studio floor? How many Saturday mornings had he spent watching her work, marveling at how his adopted daughter had grown into such a beautiful, talented young woman? The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was impossible. Every feature, every gesture, every tilt of her head screamed the name that had been carved into his heart 3 years ago. "I need." James's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I need to speak with that worker. The woman by the Eastern Beam connection." Rodriguez followed his gaze, squinting in the morning light. "Zara? She's one of our best. Been with us about 8 months now. Came highly recommended from a Detroit crew." "Why?" "Detroit." James's heart hammered against his ribs. Amelia had been born in Detroit before the adoption agency had placed her with James and his late wife, Catherine. It was a detail buried in sealed files, a piece of her history they'd planned to share with her when she turned 21. She died 3 months before her 21st birthday. "Sir." Rodriguez's concern was growing more evident. "Maybe you should sit down. You look." "Get her." The words came out harder than James intended. "Bring her over here. Now." Rodriguez hesitated, clearly sensing the electric tension radiating from his boss. "Sir, she's working. The safety protocols require." "I don't care about protocols." The shout escaped before James could stop it, causing several nearby workers to look up from their tasks. He forced his voice lower, but the tremor remained. "Please. Just ask her to come over here. Tell her the owner wants to meet her." As Rodriguez walked away, James pressed his palms against his temples, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Grief played tricks on the mind, he knew that. He'd seen Amelia's face in crowds before, had chased shadows down city streets only to find strangers who looked nothing like her in daylight. But this was different. This wasn't a glimpse or a trick of light. This was sustained, impossible, devastating clarity. Zara looked up as Rodriguez approached her, and even from 30 feet away, James could see her eyebrows rise in the exact same way Amelia's used to when she was curious about something. She nodded at whatever Rodriguez was saying, then began walking toward James, her movements fluid and confident. With each step she took, James felt the carefully built walls around his heart cracking, 3 years of suppressed grief threatening to pour out all at once. She was alive. Somehow, impossibly, his daughter was alive. James Wellington sat in his Bentley outside the construction site for 47 minutes, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The rational part of his mind, the part that had built an empire through calculated decisions and cold logic, screamed that he was losing his grip on reality. Dead daughters didn't come back as construction workers. Grief didn't manifest as living, breathing women operating cranes 35 floors above Manhattan. Yet his hands trembled as he finally stepped out of the car. "It's impossible," he muttered to himself, straightening his $1,000 tie. "Stress. That's all this is. Too many 18-hour days, too much bourbon, too little sleep." But even as he spoke the words, his mind replayed that moment with crystalline clarity, the way she tilted her head when concentrating, exactly like Amara used to do over her homework. The precise angle of her jaw. The small scar above her left eyebrow that matched the one Amara had gotten falling from her bicycle at age 10. His phone buzzed. A text from his therapist, Dr. Peterson. "James, you missed our appointment. Are you all right?" He deleted it without responding. Meanwhile, high above the city streets, Zara Johnson tried to focus on connecting steel beams, but her mind kept drifting to the strange encounter from earlier. She'd worked construction for 7 years, dealt with her share of supervisors and executives who barely acknowledged her existence. But something about the way that silver-haired man had stared at her felt different. Desperate. Almost familiar. "You're distracted today, Z," called out Tommy Martinez, her crane partner. That beam connection was off by 2 inches. "Sorry," she replied, adjusting her safety harness. "Just thinking. About that fancy suit who was gawking at you earlier?" Man looked like he'd seen a ghost. Zara's stomach clenched. She'd noticed him too, standing frozen on the observation platform, his face drained of color. For a brief moment, their eyes had met across the construction chaos, and she'd felt an inexplicable jolt of recognition. But that was impossible. She didn't run in billionaire circles. "Probably just another investor checking on his money," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Down in the site trailer, James paced like a caged animal while Mike Rodriguez shuffled through blueprints, oblivious to his boss's internal war. "The beam installation is ahead of schedule, Mr. Wellington. Your crew is exceptional. Especially that Johnson woman. She's got an eye for precision I rarely see." Johnson. James's voice came out strangled. "Zara Johnson. Been with us for 6 months. Transferred from our Detroit operation. Hell of a worker, if you don't mind me saying." Detroit. James's blood turned to ice. Amara had been born in Detroit before he and his wife adopted her. Before she became his daughter, his light, his reason for breathing. "I need her file," James said suddenly. Rodriguez looked up, confused. "Sir." "Her employment file. Background check. Everything we have on her." "Mr. Wellington, that's highly irregular. Is there a problem with her work?" James forced his voice to steady. "Just routine executive review. Bring it to my office tomorrow morning." But routine was the last thing this felt like. Nothing about this day felt routine. After Rodriguez left, James sat alone in the trailer, his head in his hands. He tried to summon Amara's face, really summon it, not the idealized version from photographs, but the living, breathing girl who used to steal cookies from the kitchen and leave crayon drawings on his desk. The harder he tried, the more her features seemed to blur and shift, replaced by the face of the woman in the hard hat. "This is insanity," he whispered to the empty trailer. Amara is dead. I buried her. I spoke at her funeral. But doubt crept in like water through concrete cracks. The closed casket. The fire. The investigators who said dental records were the only way to confirm identity. His wife Sarah had insisted on cremation immediately after, said she couldn't bear to think of their baby girl in the ground. Sarah, his ex-wife, who had left him 6 months after the funeral, claiming he'd become a stranger consumed by ghosts. James pulled out his phone, scrolled to her contact, then put it away. He'd called her enough times in the past 3 years, usually drunk, usually desperate, always hoping she'd tell him something, anything, that would make the pain stop. She'd stopped answering 2 years ago. Up on the 35th floor, Zara finished her shift with mechanical precision, but her mind remained clouded. As she descended in the construction elevator, she found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories, the ones about her parents, about the life they'd had in Detroit before the accident that changed everything. "Sometimes I look at you, baby girl," her grandmother had said just last month, "and I see something in your eyes that don't quite fit. Like you're searching for something you can't even name." The elevator reached ground level with a metallic clang, jolting Zara back to the present. She stepped out into the late afternoon chaos of the construction site, workers heading home, supervisors doing final safety checks. That's when she saw him again. James Wellington stood by the site entrance, no longer in his expensive suit but wearing dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, as if he tried to make himself less conspicuous, less intimidating. But there was nothing inconspicuous about the raw hunger in his eyes as he watched her approach. Their gazes locked for the second time that day, and Zara felt that same inexplicable jolt of recognition, stronger now, more insistent. She had 2 choices: walk past him like any sensible person would, or confront whatever this strange connection was. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, "Sometimes the Lord puts us exactly where we need to be." Zara made her choice. She walked directly toward James Wellington, her work boots steady on the concrete, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're the owner," she said when she was close enough to see the lines of grief etched around his eyes. "I am. And you've been watching me all day." James's throat worked. "Yes." "Why?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. James opened his mouth, closed it, then finally whispered the words that would change both their lives forever. "Because you look exactly like my daughter." The emergency room at Mount Sinai Hospital buzzed with controlled chaos, but for James Wellington, the world had narrowed to the uncomfortable plastic chair beside bed 12. He hadn't left Zara's side for 6 hours, not since the ambulance had rushed them both here after her fall. His $1,000 suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, but none of that mattered now. "Sir, visiting hours ended 2 hours ago," a young nurse approached hesitantly. Even she seemed to recognize the incongruity of this powerful white man keeping vigil beside a black construction worker. "I'm not leaving," James stated simply, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his wishes respected. "She has no family in the city. Someone needs to be here when she wakes up." The nurse glanced at Zara's still form, then back at James. Something in his expression, raw, desperate, protective, made her nod and retreat without further argument. James studied Zara's face in the harsh fluorescent light. Even unconscious, even with a bandage covering the gash on her forehead, The resemblance was undeniable. The same delicate arch of eyebrows, the same stubborn set to her jaw that Maya had inherited, or that he'd thought she'd inherited. The same hands, long-fingered and graceful despite their calluses. His phone had been buzzing incessantly. Margaret. Board members. The mayor's office. A construction accident involving the CEO personally was news, especially when it involved him catching a falling worker in front of dozens of witnesses. But James had turned the phone face down hours ago. Water, Zara's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through James's thoughts like a blade. He was on his feet instantly, pouring water from the plastic pitcher into a cup, adding a bendy straw without thinking, the same automatic care he'd shown Maya during her recovery from pneumonia 2 years before the accident. "Take it slow," he murmured, supporting the back of her head as she sipped. The intimacy of the gesture struck them both, and for a moment, time suspended itself. Zara's eyes, Maya's eyes, searched his face. "You stayed. I couldn't leave you alone." The honesty in his voice surprised them both. She struggled to sit up, wincing. "I don't understand. I'm nobody to you. I'm just." "You're not nobody." The words came out harder than he'd intended, carrying 3 years of buried grief. "You saved that kid's life today. You could have died. It's my job." "No, it isn't. Your job is steelwork, not throwing yourself in front of falling debris to protect a 10-year-old boy." James's voice cracked. Heroes aren't supposed to just be doing their job. Zara stared at him, trying to reconcile this raw, emotional man with the distant billionaire she'd imagined. "Why do you care so much? You don't even know me." The question hung between them like a live wire. James opened his mouth, then closed it, the truth too large and impossible to voice. How could he explain that looking at her was like seeing Maya alive again? How could he tell her that for the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight in his chest had lifted, just slightly? "I had a daughter," he said finally, the words scraping his throat raw. "She would have been about your age." Had. "She died 3 years ago. Car accident." He couldn't meet her eyes. "She was adopted. I found her when she was 7, living in a group home in Chicago. Her parents had died, and she'd been in the system for months. One look at this fierce, brilliant little girl, and I knew she was meant to be mine." Zara's expression softened. "She was lucky to have you. I was lucky to have her." James's hands clenched into fists. "But I failed her. I was working in Dubai when the accident happened. Some deal that seemed so important at the time. She was driving to surprise me at the airport, and a drunk driver." He stopped, unable to finish. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of the hospital, machines beeping, distant conversations, the hum of fluorescent lights. "What was her name?" Zara asked gently. "Maya." The name was a prayer, a wound, a blessing. Maya Wellington. "Tell me about her." And so he did. Sitting in that sterile hospital room, James found himself sharing stories he'd locked away for 3 years. Maya's first day at private school, when she'd punched a boy for making racist comments and then calmly explained to the principal that some things were worth fighting for. Her graduation speech at Columbia, where she'd talked about building bridges, literal and metaphorical, between divided communities. Her laugh, which could fill a room. Her stubborn insistence on working construction during summer breaks, despite his protests. She wanted to understand the business from the ground up, James said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Said she couldn't design buildings if she didn't know how they were really built. She sounds incredible. She was going to change the world. His voice broke. Instead, I buried her in Woodlawn Cemetery, and I've been dying a little bit every day since. Zara reached out instinctively, covering his hand with hers. The touch was electric, grounding. I'm sorry. No parent should have to bury their child. They sat in silence, her small hand covering his larger one, both of them suspended in a moment that felt sacred and fragile. The resemblance, James said finally. It's uncanny. When I first saw you today, I thought, he shook his head. I thought maybe I was losing my mind. Or maybe, Zara said softly, the universe has a strange sense of timing. Outside the window, Manhattan glittered in the darkness, a city of 8 million souls, each carrying their own griefs, their own hopes. Inside room 12, two broken people found themselves inexplicably bound together, neither understanding why fate had placed them in each other's path, but both too exhausted and too desperate for connection to question it. The night stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities neither dared to name. The coffee shop on 42nd Street buzzed with the afternoon rush, but in their corner booth, James and Zara existed in a bubble of tense silence. 3 days had passed since their first encounter, 3 days of cautious meetings and careful conversations that danced around the elephant in the room. James stared at the untouched latte growing cold between his hands, gathering courage for what he was about to reveal. Her name was Amara, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I adopted her when she was 12. She'd been in the system for 5 years after her parents died in a fire in Chicago. Zara's breath caught. Chicago. The same city where her own fragmented memories began and ended. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracting a photograph with the reverence of a man handling a religious artifact. He slid it across the scarred wooden table. This was taken on her 16th birthday, 6 months before. The photo showed a radiant young black woman with Zara's exact features, the same almond-shaped eyes, the same dimpled smile, even the same small scar above the left eyebrow that Zara had always wondered about. But it was the background that made Zara's world tilt on its axis, the distinctive Chicago skyline, and in the corner of the frame, a partial view of a building she recognized from her childhood nightmares. The Riverside Children's Home, Zara whispered, her fingers trembling as she traced the photograph's edges. James's head snapped up. You know it. I lived there. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. From when I was 7 until I was 12. There was a fire. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to grasp memories that had always felt like smoke. I remember a man coming to visit some of the older kids. He was kind. He wore expensive suits and always brought books. That was me, James said, his voice cracking. I started visiting Riverside after my wife died. She'd always wanted children, but we never. I thought maybe I could make a difference. And then I met Amara. Zara stared at him, pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed suddenly clicking into place. There was another girl there. Keisha. We looked so much alike that the staff sometimes mixed us up. She was 5 years older, and I followed her everywhere like a shadow. James's hands began to shake. Amara told me about a little girl at the home. She called her little sister, even though they weren't related. She said the girl reminded her of herself at that age, lost, angry, but trying so hard to be brave. The coffee shop seemed to fade around them as buried memories surfaced. Zara closed her eyes and let herself remember, sneaking into the older girl's dormitory to listen to Keisha tell stories, sharing stolen cookies from the kitchen, the way Keisha would braid her hair and promise that someday they'd both have real families. She used to say she'd come back for me, Zara whispered. After she got adopted, she promised she'd find a way to bring me home too. James pulled out his phone with shaking hands, scrolling through old photos until he found what he was looking for. She tried, he said, showing Zara the screen. This is from her laptop. I found it after the accident. The image was a meticulously researched document titled Finding Zara Johnson. It contained printed emails with social workers, screenshots of missing children websites, and handwritten notes in the margins. Amara had been searching for her little sister for 3 years, tracking her from Chicago to Detroit to New York, always one step behind. She was going to surprise me, James continued, his voice thick with grief and wonder. She'd found out you were working construction in New York. She was planning to drive down from Columbia University that weekend to find you and bring you to meet me. She wanted us to be a real family, all 3 of us. Zara's composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she realized the cruel irony. While she'd been building James's tower, Amara had been preparing to reunite them. The accident. A drunk driver on the FDR Drive. She was on her way to your job site in Queens. James's voice broke completely. She had your work address written on a piece of paper in her purse. The police thought it was just random information. The weight of lost time, missed connections, and twisted fate settled between them like a living thing. Zara understood now why James had looked at her with such desperate hope, why his eyes held both recognition and agony. She wasn't just a stranger who resembled his daughter. She was the missing piece Amara had died trying to restore. She loved you, James said, reaching across the table to cover Zara's hand with his own. Even after all those years, she never stopped thinking about you. She used to say that family wasn't just about blood, it was about choosing to love someone and never giving up on them. Zara looked down at their joined hands, his pale and soft from years of boardroom comfort, hers dark and calloused from honest work, and saw not difference but connection. The same hands that had failed to save Amara might yet save them both. I remember her last words to me at the children's home, Zara said softly. She said, "Don't worry, little sister. Someday we'll have a daddy who builds things instead of breaking them." I never understood what she meant. James squeezed her hand tighter, and for the first time in 3 years, felt something other than emptiness in his chest. She was talking about me. The late afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of James's penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floors where Zara sat cross-legged, examining a photo album that had been gathering dust for 3 years. Her work boots sat neatly by the door, a small gesture of respect that hadn't gone unnoticed. She was beautiful, Zara whispered, her finger tracing the edge of a photograph showing a laughing 8-year-old girl with pigtails, sitting on James's shoulders at Coney Island. The resemblance was so striking it made her chest tighten. What was her favorite thing to do? James settled onto the couch nearby, close enough to share the memories but far enough to respect the fragile space between them. For the first time in years, his voice carried warmth instead of the hollow echo of grief. Build things. Just like her old man. She had this obsession with Lincoln logs, would spend hours creating entire cities. Said she was going to design houses that made people feel safe. Safe, Zara repeated softly, understanding flooding her eyes. That's what I felt the first time I climbed a crane. Like I was finally high enough to see everything clearly, you know? The chaos down below made sense from up there. Maya used to say the same thing about our construction sites. I'd take her to visit projects on weekends, and she'd insist on climbing as high as safety regulations would allow. His laugh was bittersweet. She had your fearlessness, your presence. Zara turned the page, revealing a photo of Maya at a school science fair, beaming beside a model bridge made of popsicle sticks. Tell me about this one. 3rd grade. She insisted on entering the engineering competition even though she was competing against 5th graders. Spent 2 weeks in the garage, rebuilding that bridge over and over until it could hold 20 pounds of books. James's eyes softened with the memory. She came in 2nd place and told me, "Daddy, next year I'm gonna build one that holds a car." Did she? Zara asked, though something in James's expression already gave her the answer. She never got the chance. His voice cracked slightly. The accident happened 6 months later. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of loss and the warmth of remembered love filling the space between them. Outside, the sounds of the city provided a gentle backdrop. Honking taxis, distant sirens, the rhythm of life continuing despite tragedy. I have something like that, Zara said suddenly, reaching into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a small worn photograph of herself at about Maya's age, standing proudly next to an elaborate sandcastle. My grandmother kept this. Said my parents took it the summer before they died. I was convinced I was going to be an architect, build castles for real. James studied the photo, seeing not just the physical resemblance but something deeper, the same determined glint in the eyes, the same proud set to the shoulders. What changed your mind? Life, I guess. After my parents died, dreams felt like luxuries I couldn't afford. Construction work paid the bills, kept Grandma's house from being foreclosed on. She shrugged, but there was no bitterness in her voice. But you know what? I still love building things. Maybe not castles, but structures that matter. Places where people work, live, dream. Maya would have loved meeting you, James said quietly. She always said she wanted a big sister to teach her how to be brave. The words hit Zara unexpectedly, and she felt tears prick her eyes. I think I would have loved being her big sister, teaching her to use power tools, showing her how to read blueprints. She knew how to read blueprints, James chuckled. Started learning when she was 6. Used to help me review project plans, pointing out places where she thought we needed more windows for Happy Light. Happy Light. Her term for the kind of sunlight that made people smile. She had this theory that buildings could make people feel emotions based on how the light moved through them. His voice grew thoughtful. I never built another project with that kind of intentionality after she died. Everything became about profit margins and completion schedules. Zara closed the photo album gently and looked directly at him. Maybe it's time to build something with happy light again. The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and hope. James felt something in his chest that he'd thought was permanently broken begin to flutter back to life. Not the desperate ache of grief, but the warm stirring of purpose. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about that community center project in Detroit that got shelved last year. Budget constraints," the board said. "But what if we didn't worry about profit margins for once? What if we built something that mattered?" Zara's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "I'm serious. A place for kids like Maya, like you were. A place where they can dream about building castles and know that someone believes those dreams matter." For the first time since they'd met, Zara smiled without reservation, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face and made James's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with possibility. In that smile, he saw not a replacement for his lost daughter, but a partner in honoring her memory. "When do we start?" she asked. "Have you ever found healing in an unexpected place? Sometimes the people we meet in our darkest moments become the light we didn't know we needed. What do you think about second chances? Drop your thoughts below." The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like the end of the world. James sat in his penthouse office, the manila envelope trembling in his hands like a death sentence. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly below him, but he might as well have been staring into an abyss. The lab technician's clinical language blurred together, no biological relationship. Conclusive results. 99.9% certainty. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of hope, of planning, of believing that miracles could happen twice in one lifetime. 3 weeks of Zara calling him every evening, their conversations growing longer, deeper, more precious. 3 weeks of falling in love with the idea that his daughter had somehow returned to him. His phone buzzed. Zara's name lit up the screen with a photo he'd taken of her laughing at a diner in Queens, syrup on her chin, looking so much like Amara that his heart had nearly stopped. "Good morning, James." Her voice was warm honey over gravel. "How are you feeling? Ready for today?" Today. They were supposed to meet for lunch at the Rainbow Room. He was going to tell her about the trust fund he'd established, about his plans to put her through college, about the adoption papers his lawyer had quietly prepared. He was going to ask her to be his daughter, officially and forever. "Zara, I." The words died in his throat like poisoned birds. "James? You sound strange. What's wrong?" He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 7 years old again, standing in his father's study while the old man explained why love was a luxury poor men couldn't afford. "Business is business, boy. Sentiment will destroy you faster than bad concrete." "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice turning to ice as the familiar walls rebuilt themselves around his heart. "About us. About this whole situation." The silence on the other end stretched like a held breath. "Okay," she said slowly. "I'm listening." The DNA results came back. Each word felt like swallowing glass. We're not related, Zara. This whole thing has been a mistake." He heard her sharp intake of breath, Could picture her face crumbling the way Amara's had when he'd had to explain why some kids at school called her names, why the world would sometimes be cruel to her just for existing. A mistake, she repeated, her voice hollow. 3 weeks of everything we shared was a mistake? I got caught up in wishful thinking. You reminded me of someone I lost, and I projected that onto you. It wasn't fair to either of us. James, what are you saying? Are you saying you don't want to see me anymore? Because the DNA. I'm saying this was an error in judgment on my part. The words came easier now, each one building the wall higher. I allowed my grief to cloud my judgment. You're a fine young woman, but we come from different worlds, Zara. I should have remembered that from the beginning. The silence that followed was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Different worlds. You mean because I'm black and you're white? Because I'm poor and you're rich? I mean because this isn't sustainable. What did you think was going to happen? That I'd adopt a grown woman? That we'd play house and pretend biology doesn't matter? Biology. The hurt in her voice transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Is that what you think this was about for me? Your money? Your guilt over losing your real daughter? Amara was my real daughter, he snapped, and immediately regretted it. The words hung in the air like a poison cloud. Through the phone, he could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, the sound of someone trying not to break apart. I see, she said finally. So I was just, what? A replacement? A stand-in for your grief? That's not what I meant. No, I think that's exactly what you meant. Her voice grew stronger now, edged with a fury that made him think of steel being forged in fire. You know what's funny, James? I actually thought, God, I'm such an idiot. I actually thought you cared about me. Not because I looked like her, but because of who I am. Zara. I told you things I've never told anyone. About my parents, about feeling invisible my whole life, about dreaming of having a father who gave a damn. And you sat there listening, knowing it was all built on a lie. It wasn't a lie. It was all a lie. The words exploded from her like a dam bursting. Every dinner, every story you told me about your daughter, every time you looked at me like I mattered, it was all just you trying to resurrect a dead girl. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Don't you dare talk about Amara that way. Why not? She's gone, James. She's been gone for 3 years, and I'm here. I'm alive, and I'm real, and I thought maybe that mattered to you. Her voice broke on the last words, and James felt something inside his chest crack along with it. But the walls were up now, solid and familiar, and he couldn't find his way back to the man who had laughed with her over pancakes and told her stories about building skyscrapers that touched the clouds. I'm sorry, he said, but even to his own ears, the words sounded empty. I'm truly sorry, Zara. You deserve better than this. You're right, she said quietly. I do deserve better. I deserve someone who sees me, not a ghost. I deserve someone who doesn't run the minute things get complicated. This isn't running. This is exactly running. And you know what the saddest part is? I would have stayed anyway. Even knowing I wasn't her, even knowing I could never be her, I would have stayed because I thought we had something real. But I guess that's the difference between us. I know how to love people for who they are, not who I want them to be." The line went dead. James sat in his empty office, surrounded by the monuments to his success, and felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the fact that he had just destroyed the best thing that had happened to him since Amara died. On a construction site in Queens, Zara Johnson threw her phone into her tool bag and wiped her eyes with the back of her work gloves, leaving streaks of dirt on her cheeks like war paint. She had work to do, bills to pay, a life to live, a life that had somehow felt fuller 3 weeks ago when she thought she was nobody special to anybody. Now she knew she was nobody special to anybody. Again. The penthouse felt like a tomb. James sat in his leather chair, the same one where he'd once read bedtime stories to Amara, staring at the DNA results that had arrived by courier an hour ago. The clinical language couldn't diminish the miracle printed in black and white. 99.97% probability of paternal relationship. His hands trembled as he set the papers aside. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, Detroit's skyline glittered in the evening light, but all he could see was Zara's face when she'd walked away from him at the hospital. The devastation, the betrayal, the finality in her voice when she'd said, "I don't need a father who's ashamed of what I am." The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Wellington?" Margaret's voice was hesitant. "There's a Gladys Johnson here to see you. She says it's about Zara." James's heart hammered against his ribs. "Send her up. Immediately." 3 minutes felt like 3 hours before the elevator doors opened and Zara's grandmother stepped into his penthouse. Gladys Johnson was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'4", but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had weathered every storm life could throw. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and her dark eyes, Zara's eyes, held a mixture of sadness and steel. "Mrs. Johnson." James stood, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for coming." "Sit down, son." Her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "We need to talk." They settled across from each other, the coffee table between them feeling like an ocean. Gladys studied his face for a long moment, and James had the uncomfortable sensation of being weighed and measured. "You hurt my grandbaby," she said finally. "That girl has been through enough pain for 10 lifetimes. And you broke her heart all over again." "Mrs. Johnson, I'm not finished." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Zara told me everything. About finding you, about the DNA test, about what you said at that hospital." She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "Now I want you to tell me something, James Wellington. Do you love her?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "With every breath in my body." "Then why did you let her walk away?" James ran his hands through his hair, the weight of 3 years of grief and 3 weeks of hope crushing down on him. "Because I'm terrified. Because I lost her once, and it nearly killed me. Because loving her means risking that pain again, and I don't know if I'm strong enough." Gladys's expression softened slightly. "You want to know something about that girl? When she was 8 years old, right after her parents died, she stopped talking for 6 months. Wouldn't say a word to anyone. The doctors said it was trauma, that she might never speak again." James felt tears building behind his eyes. "But every night," Gladys continued, she'd whisper to her pillow. "The same thing over and over. 'Daddy, please come find me. Daddy, please don't forget me. Her voice broke slightly. It took me 2 years to convince her that being abandoned wasn't her fault, that some daddies just couldn't find their way back to their babies. Oh God. The words escaped as a broken whisper. Gladys, I searched everywhere. Private investigators, police, social services. I never stopped looking. I know, baby. I know. She reached across the table and took his hands in her weathered ones. The system failed you both. But you found each other now. The question is, what are you going to do about it? James stared down at their joined hands, his pale and soft from a life of privilege, hers dark and strong from decades of hard work. She won't see me. She thinks I'm ashamed of her because she's black, because she works construction, because she's not the daughter I lost. And are you? Ashamed? No. The word came out fierce, certain. She's the strongest, most beautiful person I've ever known. I'm proud of her. I'm proud to be her father. But I was so afraid of losing her again that I made her feel like she wasn't enough. Gladys smiled for the first time since entering his penthouse. There's the daddy she's been waiting for. She stood, smoothing down her dress. Zara's working the night shift at the Chicago site tonight. Tower construction, 42nd floor. She requested the transfer this afternoon, said she needed to be somewhere you weren't. James stood as well, hope and terror warring in his chest. Will she listen to me? That depends on what you say, and how you say it. Gladys moved toward the elevator, then turned back. James? When you find her, and you will find her, don't you dare let fear steal another moment from either of you. That girl has been strong enough for both of you her whole life. Now it's your turn. After she left, James stood alone in his penthouse, staring at the DNA results again. But this time, he wasn't seeing clinical proof of paternity. He was seeing a roadmap home. He grabbed his keys, his heart, and what remained of his courage, and headed for the door. Chicago was only an hour away by private jet, and his daughter, his miracle, his Zara, was waiting, whether she knew it or not. The choice had been made. Now came the hardest part, proving he was worthy of the second chance they'd both been given. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air of Central Park carried the sound of children's laughter and the gentle rustle of golden leaves. James Wellington sat on a bench near the Bethesda fountain, no longer the rigid businessman in his $1,000 suits, but a father in comfortable jeans and a sweater his daughter had picked out for him. His hair had more silver now, but his eyes held a warmth that had been absent for years. "Dad, you're going to be late for your own groundbreaking ceremony," Zara said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee from their favorite vendor. She wore a flowing dress the color of autumn leaves, her natural hair styled in elegant locks that caught the afternoon light. The transformation from construction worker to construction executive had been remarkable, but what struck everyone who met her was how she carried both versions of herself with equal grace. "Let them wait," James said, accepting the coffee and making room for her on the bench. "Some things are more important than business." They sat in comfortable silence, watching families enjoy the perfect October day. The Wellington Foundation's newest project, affordable housing in Harlem, would break ground in an hour, but for now, the world could wait. "I still can't believe you're letting me oversee the entire development," Zara said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and nervousness. "You earned it." That presentation to the city council was masterful. And besides, James smiled. Who better to build homes for working families than someone who understands their struggles? A young girl with pigtails ran past them, chasing a bright red balloon. James watched her with the easy smile of a man who had learned to see joy in simple moments again. She reminds me of you at that age. Always running toward something, never away from it. I was running away for a long time, though, Zara admitted quietly. Running from the pain of losing my parents, from the fear that I'd never be enough, that I'd never find where I belonged. And now. She turned to look at him, this man who had started as a stranger glimpsed through office windows and had become the father she'd never dared hope for. Now I know that sometimes the family you're meant to have finds you in the most unexpected places. Even 35 floors up on a construction site in Manhattan. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I wanted to give you this today, before all the cameras and chaos of the groundbreaking. Zara opened it to find a delicate gold bracelet, simple but elegant, with a single charm, a small construction crane. Dad, it's beautiful. Read the inscription. She held it up to catch the light. To Zara, you built me a bridge back to love. Dad. Tears threatened to spill as she fastened it around her wrist. I love you too, Dad. More than you could ever know. I do know, he said softly, because for 3 years, I forgot what love felt like. I thought God had taken everything from me when I lost Angela. But he was just preparing me to find you, not as a replacement for the daughter I lost, but as the daughter I was meant to find. They stood together, and James pulled her into the kind of hug that spoke of Sunday dinners shared, late-night conversations about dreams and fears, and the countless small moments that had woven them into a real family over the past months. Ready to go build some homes? Zara asked, linking her arm through his. With you? I'm ready to build anything. As they walked toward the waiting car that would take them to Harlem, neither of them noticed the red balloon that had drifted high above the fountain, caught by the wind and soaring toward the sky, a perfect metaphor for dreams that seemed impossible until suddenly they weren't. The groundbreaking ceremony was everything the media had promised. Cameras, politicians, and carefully rehearsed speeches about urban development and social responsibility. But when James introduced Zara as both his daughter and the project director, when he spoke not from prepared remarks but from his heart about second chances and unexpected miracles, the crowd fell silent. 6 months ago, I was a man who had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering crowd in Marcus Garvey Park. Today, I stand here not just as CEO of Wellington Construction, but as the proud father of the most remarkable woman I know. This housing development isn't just about buildings. It's about building hope, building community, and building bridges between worlds that should never have been separate in the first place. Zara stepped forward to break ground with the ceremonial golden shovel, but she paused to look out at the faces in the crowd, faces that looked like hers, families who would soon call this place home. My grandmother always told me that the Lord puts us exactly where we need to be, she said, her voice strong and clear. I used to think that meant enduring whatever came my way. Now I know it means something better. It means we're all exactly where we need to be to find each other, to build something beautiful together, and to prove that love really can conquer everything that tries to divide us. As the golden shovel broke through the earth, as the cameras flashed and the crowd applauded, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. Not in a boardroom or behind a mahogany desk, but here beside his daughter, building something that would last long after they were both gone. That evening, as the sun set over the Harlem skyline, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, James and Zara sat on the roof of the Wellington Plaza, sharing takeout Chinese food and planning the future. What do you think Angela would say about all this? Zara asked softly. James was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. I think she'd say what she always said when I worried too much about business. Daddy, stop thinking and start feeling. And you know what? I finally am. The city lights began to twinkle below them, each one representing dreams, struggles, hopes, and the infinite possibility that tomorrow might bring exactly the miracle someone needed. This story proves that love finds a way, even in the most unexpected places. What's the most surprising way love has shown up in your life? Share your story below. I believe in the power of these connections. In the end, James Wellington learned that losing everything can sometimes mean finding everything that truly matters. And Zara Johnson discovered that the family you choose can be even more powerful than the one you're born into, especially when that choice is made not from convenience, but from the kind of love that builds bridges, breaks down walls, and proves that the best construction projects aren't made of steel and concrete, but of hope, healing, and the unshakable foundation of unconditional love.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you love this story, you will surely enjoy the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing as you can never imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.